That's it, gentlemen. We're live.
All right.
Working out. It's working out. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Shabbos show with our special guest, Gary Kahalnik. If you watch the Shabbos show today and you say, watching these three, it's like they've been friends forever and they have such a wonderful relationship, it's not a lie.
It's not a lie.
It's not a lie. We're dear friends and enjoy each other so much, and so it's our pleasure to have Gary on today. And our topic is Israel and the state of Israel. Which of you gentlemen wants to lead off?
Well, I mean, it'd be great to start with this question. We asked you to join this program. How did you ever get involved in Israel in the first place?
Well, it's when I was in high school, when I actually started high school, a friend of mine introduced me to a youth group called Young Judea. And there was no Young Judea club, believe it or not, in Skokie, Illinois, one of the most Jewish suburbs in the country. There was no Young Judea club there, and we started one. And by the time we all graduated from high school, it was one of the strongest clubs in the region, if not in the country. And after we graduated, a number of us went to Israel for the year on the Young Judea Year Course program, and that was what really hooked me on Israel. It was a 10-month trip, and it was probably the best trip I've ever taken in my life, and probably one of the best experiences in my life.
Were you in school during that time?
So they call it, these days they call it a gap year program. But yes, for the first 6 months we were taking classes. We were in a dormitory in Jerusalem, and we were taking classes, and all the classes that we took were college level classes. And depending on what university we came back to in the United States, you could petition to get credit for it. And I got almost a whole semester's worth of credit for the semester that I did in Israel. So that was exciting.
Very interesting.
It was calm. Everything was good. You were over there. There wasn't any shenanigans. Nothing. No big trouble going on.
Well, that was a long time ago. It was 1972, 73, and it was pretty quiet there at the time. You could pretty much travel anywhere in the country. You could walk around Jerusalem at all hours of the day and night and not have to worry about anything. And it's such a beautiful country. And we had the opportunity to explore Israel from the very north all the way down to the very south. In fact, in those days, it was just after the 1967 war, the 6 Days War, and so Sinai was still part of the captured territories. We were actually able to go into Sinai. We visited Mount Sinai, or what they call Mount Sinai, and camped in the desert and slept overnight in the desert. And it was just wonderful. It was a wonderful experience, and it turned me on to Israel. And from that time on, and it also turned me on to Judaism, because I grew up in a pretty secular home. I was one of those kids that really didn't like going to Hebrew school. But after my time in Young Judea and spending a year on Year Course, it changed my life. And it redirected my life. And my wife, Linda, was also a Young Judean. She did not go on Year Course. She actually did a semester during college with Young Judea in Israel. But we met as a result of Young Judea, and we raised 3 children, all of whom did the Year Course program and were involved in the camping program for Young Judea. So Young Judea is a great way to involve young people in Israel and get them to create a love of Israel within those people and a love of Judaism.
Now, can I segue off of your 1972, 3, 4, right in that time period?
Yeah.
That's about when I was in Israel, too, in about 1974, which takes us...
You were 3 years old?
Yes. Which takes us to this magnificent painting that you're getting to see on acrylic, and it is a sheath. It's a nice study, and it's by the artist Menashe Kadishman. And Israel had so much to offer, and still does, of course, but when I was there in 1974, and I was about 10 years old, you could really get to know all of the Israeli artists. They were extremely approachable. Menashe Kadishman was one. And to celebrate our love for this wonderful artist, when Barry and I went on the trip with Federation, which I suppose was, 2 years ago at this point? This was the gift we brought ourselves to remember it. Menashe Kadishman started on a kibbutz as a shepherd. And so his love for sheep is often in many of his paintings. But he was just a robust, really special, wonderful guy, beautiful modern art. the Nasher Sculpture Center happens to have his sculpture, which is called Segment. So it kind of goes 1, 2, 3, 4. And I was lucky enough as a little girl to get to play underneath that sculpture. It used to live at my grandparents' house. But everything in Israel was so robust. It was so exciting. It was so fresh and new. Of course, with the price to pay
Right.
for that freedom. But I'm so glad we're here visiting about Israel and everything about Israel today.
Right. We're glad to be here for this.
Um, Israel bonds. So fast forward. How
So
have you
fast
connected?
forward, came back from Israel, went to college, got married, worked in a number of different industries, and about 7 years ago, I had a change in my career. And the change that I took was to start working for a company called the Development Corporation for Israel. And what
And will
that
you say that one more time in case they couldn't hear you really good?
Yes, the Development Corporation for Israel. And what the Development Corporation for Israel does is they market Israel government securities, specifically Israel government bonds, in the United States and in Canada and the rest of the world. But the division that I work for, we sell in the United States.
It's a Israel bond. What's different between an Israel bond and a United States bond?
So Israel bonds are backed by the government of Israel. They're guaranteed by the government of Israel, and even though they're issued in U.S. dollars, the government of Israel is the one that sets the interest rates and determines, how many bonds we're able to sell and what we're able to sell. It's an interesting story. So when the state of Israel was getting started in 1948, David Ben-Gurion didn't know what to do. I mean, they went to war immediately, and then following that, and they lost a lot of people, and following that, they really had no infrastructure in the country. And he called a meeting of world Jewish leaders that met at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1950, and he said, we've got to do something to build this country. We have to finance it somehow. And what they decided to do was they decided to issue government bonds, which people bought, and they were going to pay interest on those. It's basically the government of Israel is borrowing money from individuals or companies or whatever to use that money to build the country. And at those days, they were using it to build basic infrastructure, roads, seaports, airports, water systems, whatever it was that they needed. So David Ben-Gurion came to the United States in 1951 to introduce that program. And they rented out Madison Square Garden, and the goal was to sell about 25. They were hoping to sell $25 million worth of bonds that first time, that first issue. They ended up selling over $52 million worth of
And
bonds.
say that number again so we can all absorb
both
that.
numbers.
So they wanted to raise $25 million. They ended up selling more than $52 million worth of bonds at that point.
Wow.
And so, and from that time on, from 1952, or 1951, when the bonds were first being issued, to today, with everything that's happened in Israel, they've never defaulted on an interest or principal payment to the people that were buying bonds from the government, from the state of Israel. And to this day. And now, today, and in every generation, first it was infrastructure, right? In every generation, the Israel Bonds program was designed to help support the Israeli economy, whatever their needs were at that particular time. So it was infrastructure in those days. In the late 60s, it was rebuilding after the wars that they had in 67 and 73 and the early 70s. And today we have another issue. Because even though going into this whole thing with COVID-19 and the coronavirus, Israel's economy is one of the top 10 economies in the world. Very strong, very robust. If you look at all the different companies, startup companies in Israel, they're bringing so much good technology, good things to the world, whether it's cell phones or agricultural or medical. So going into this whole time frame that we're in right now, everything was really very strong and very good.
Right.
And it still is. But just like the United States, there's unemployment and there's all these results from this COVID virus. And so the Israeli Treasury and the Israeli government came back to Israel bonds and they said, this is what we need you for. We need you to sell those bonds so that we have a cushion, a backup in the event that we need it with everything that's going on right now. So over the past six years, let's say, that I've been with Israel Bonds, we've sold over $1 billion worth of bonds each year.
Wow.
Our goal for this year was 1.1 billion, and as a result of Israel saying we need you to be there behind us and help us support our economy through this crisis right now, they've raised our goal to $1.5 billion, so $1.5 billion, and we're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're
I know
working
one
on that
thing.
right now.
One thing the three of us were talking about before we hit the live button was that pre-COVID, so many of our friends and us were all talking about what was going to happen in September. American Airlines was offering nonstop Dallas to Tel Aviv. And so many people had begun thinking about it, making plans, groups, trips, all kinds of things. And so I think many of us are looking for a way to help Israel with dollars that we might be able to use to give some aid, some help, some support, because we're not going to be traveling there.
That's right. And buying an Israel bond is a great way to do that because it's not a donation. You're actually making an investment, and Israel will then pay you back your investment plus interest over the period of time until the bond, once the bond matures. So it's really not a donation. It's a way of investing your money. And frankly, the bond rates are as competitive as anything else in the market right now. And I would urge people to compare the rates of our bonds to anything else that they can get in a fixed asset. And they'll find that we are really very competitive. And it's a good way to support Israel. It's a really good way to support Israel. You know,
I have a question.
Sure.
And here's my last question. But is there anyone that people would recognize, or not necessarily people, but organizations? Is there anyone that we would recognize as who are large donors of investors in Israel?
Sure. So we have a lot of people locally in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that buy Israel bonds all the time. But if you want a name that I think everyone will recognize nationwide, there's a guy named Warren Buffett who has a few bucks. Pretty well-known guy around the country, and he's a huge supporter of the Israel Bonds program. He's hosted a number of events for us that has helped us sell large numbers of dollars and large numbers of bonds. And he is the only country outside of the United States. I don't know if it's still true, but I know it was true when we started our relationship with him. The only country that he's ever invested in outside of the United States has been Israel because he believes so strongly in what Israel stands for and the whole economy of Israel and the strength of that economy.
Now, Gary, I have an idea from my friend Andrea Breitbart Solka, who I grew up with. And she says, my idea, cash in my expired U.S. bonds and buy Israel bonds.
Absolutely.
That's a great one. Leave it to Andrea, right?
I would encourage that. And I would also encourage any of you who have received Israel bonds as gifts or bought Israel bonds in the past and stuck them away in a safety deposit box someplace, thinking, oh, well, we'll just let Israel keep using that money. Don't do that because Israel bonds, once they mature, stop earning interest. And the problem is the state of Israel has to set that money aside to be able to pay you back when you come and want to redeem your bond.
So cash in.
Cash in and buy a new bond. Cash in and buy a new bond because that helps Israel more than anything else.
Wow.
So, and you can get in for as little as $36. You don't have to invest millions of dollars like Warren Buffett does. For as little as $36, you can buy what we call an e-mitzvah bond, $100 for a Mazel Tov bond, and it goes up from there. So
it's great.
I imagine it's easy to find you. I know you're even on Facebook. If I need some contact information from you.
You can find our contact information on Facebook. You can Google Israel Bonds in whatever city you live in, whether it's Dallas or Houston or New York or Chicago. We have offices all over the country, and we're glad to help.
Well,
that's great.
I was walking around today just finding these objects in our home that are from the state of Israel. Some of them older, some of them not. But, you know, I've talked to you about art before. This is a beautiful ceramic dreidel. I remember each one of my siblings getting one in Israel. A hamsa that was my grandmother's.
What's a hamsa?
Hand of God. Isn't that gorgeous? It's silver. It actually lives right above my pillow in the bedroom. And then this is a new acquisition.
What in the world is this?
Right? So
Right.
it's an exotic shofar from an antelope, actually, I believe.
Wow.
I don't know.
That's beautiful.
Okay. I think this is, and then I'm going to.
What's that?
I don't know. This is your stuff now.
Well, you got this. It showed up on the doorstep.
You should take it up there so they could really see them.
These
are really cool, you guys.
Here's a new beer company, and there's a bald-headed guy, and there's a bearded guy. Well, these aren't just guys. Without this guy, Theodore Herzl, we don't know if Israel would have been a state where it is today. It could have been in Africa. And if it was for David Ben-Gurion, we don't know what would have happened because he was a leadership above leaders. At the time we needed him, in 1948 during the war, and far after that. Well,
I wonder if you're going to talk to us about the Torah portion this week.
Oh, okay. I forgot. It's Shabbat, and there's a Torah portion. Okay. Well, here's what's going on this week. This week's Shabbat has to do with concluding the book of Numbers, and there's a double parsha again. So here's what's going on. It's been almost 40 years, and the Israelites are preparing to go across the Jordan River. They've conquered all the lands east of the Jordan. Well, a couple of guys, right, come from two tribes, come and make a couple of requests for Moses. One of the requests happens to be they want to have the grasslands next on the east side of the Jordan for their flocks of sheep and their cattle. They have great livestock. And the second request is they're tired of fighting. They don't want to go into Israel. They don't want to go into Canaan as it was at the time. They don't want to go to the promised land. They want to stay put. Well, Moses says, holy smokes, but he has leadership qualities, just like David Ben-Gurion. He doesn't say no. Instead, he says he tells them his fears. The first fear is, well, you can't let your brothers fight your fight. This is everyone's fight. We have to all fight and conquer this land for it to have peace. Number two, you can't just go without having these the rest of the tribes are going to say, we don't want to go either. This is really important. 40 years ago, your parents said, we don't want to go, and look where that got you. 40 years in the wilderness. Well, these two guys back up, they huddle. They use the word huddle back in those days, and they come back and said, it's remarkable. Instead of arguing with Moses, they said, we understand, we listen, we heard, we understand, and we are not going to just go and fight with you to conquer this land, but we're going to lead the way. We're going to be the vanguard. We're going to be the frontal force to make certain this land is conquered and all the Israelite families will have their proper inheritance. How great is that? Shabbat Shalom.
And the Academy Award goes to
Well done.
Barry Rothschild, Porsche,
Oh my God.
pre-Shabbat.
I have a speech.
You want to see the holla?
Where is the holla?
Well, it's slow today because I got a little behind. So it still has some time, and it's gone a little rogue. Some little parts decided to kind of pop up and do their own thing. Surprise, surprise. But it's working. It has a little bit of time. Things are working themselves. It doesn't mind the heat out here one darn
not
bit.
at all.
It's going to be beautiful.
Yep.
And Gary, for coming on our show, this is all new sticky shtick we've got going on. We have prizes now for our special guest.
Oh boy.
Yes, and so you better check out your prizes.
Prizes? What the heck?
Well, let's see.
Shabbat show prizes.
Israeli shaving soap, which is
Whoa.
actually good for me because I do a lot of shaving. Let's see, what do we have here? Israeli wine? Let's see, grape brandy. Wow, very nice.
From the Galilee.
From the Galilee. And skin calming cream.
Oh,
In this environment, anything that'll keep anything calm is a good thing. Thank you guys so much. That's so nice of you.
we're so happy that you came on to talk about your experience with Israel and Israel bonds, and we learned a little bit about the Torah portion. And I just I'm hoping that this is a time that we all begin to transition into the soothing ourselves, into those moments where it's a little easier to make our way into Shabbat and let go of those to-do lists and let go of all of the creating. I hope that's what's happening as we all depart from our segment together.
Well, I hope so too, and I thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to share some of my stories with you. And this has been a joy. It's been really, really fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Debbie, do you have anything else to say?
Just a big romantic kiss.
Oh, I thought you meant me. Shabbat
Bye,
shalom,
everybody.
everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.